Well, we're heading into the home stretch here with topics for Bio 156. This week we're going to be revisiting the topic of evolution, which we first examined near the very beginning of the semester. Now we're going to look at some of the ways in which evolution can occur. In other words, some of the specific scenarios that involve the principles of natural selection and how they play out to cause changes to occur over many generations in a population. So we're first going to look at some of the causes of microevolution. And just so you know, microevolution is basically a description of the events of evolution that occur within a specific population. Okay, so microevolution is evolution within a population, and of course the ideas and the mechanisms of natural selection apply within that population in terms of how it goes about evolving. I'll give you one example of microevolution that's sort of a classic example that's often described in textbooks, and that is the change in population of the pepper moth. The pepper moth is a moth that's commonly found throughout England, and during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s there was a huge shift in the air quality as a result of all the machinery being used and all of the oil being burned, and there was a huge amount of soot, black soot, being put out into the atmosphere. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, the pepper moth in England, all of the pepper, not all, but the majority of individuals in the populations of pepper moths had this very black and white peppery appearance to them. And you can see that on most trees, the black and white or salt and pepper version of the pepper moth blended in very nicely on the trunks of trees. Now there was another color morph, just means another variety of pepper moth, same species, just different color, like some of us have blonde hair and some of us have brown hair. Some moths in the population had very dark wings, and you can see that against a tree like the one in this picture, the black moths stand very readily out, and they're very easily seen by birds and thus predated or eaten by those birds. When the Industrial Revolution occurred, though, so much soot started to accumulate on rocks, trees, and bark, etc., that it darkened up significantly the bark of the trees, and suddenly the moths that had once been very well hidden on the bark of trees became the ones that were easily seen by birds and thus eaten, and the ones that had the darker wings suddenly had a favorable adaptation for the population. And what we saw over time was that more and more individuals in the pepper moth's population tended to be of the darker color morph. So these became the predominant color morph, whereas previous to the Industrial Revolution, the lighter morph had been the favored morph. Now, the best current day examples I can give you of microevolution are ones that I've discussed before in class, and they include antibiotic resistance. Again, remember, if we influence a population of bacteria by exposing them to a particular antibiotic, individual bacterial cells in that population that have the ability to withstand 5, 6, 7, or 8, 9, 10 days worth of antibiotic exposure will survive beyond the point when you stop your antibiotic regimen, and then will persist, so that now we have selected for bacteria that are highly resistant to the antibiotic, which isn't a good thing. Flu virus is a similar situation in the sense that the flu virus is a very rapidly evolving virus, and as such, every year we have to get a different flu shot to vaccinate against the current strain of flu virus that's most likely to hit the United States. And again, that's because the flu virus is constantly changing. We have to keep modifying our vaccine to keep up with how the flu virus looks, so that our immune system can best identify the flu virus if we're exposed to it and clear it from the body. So let's talk for a minute about some mechanisms by which this evolution on a population scale can occur. One example, or one very common way in which microevolution can occur, is through genetic mutations. We all know that, for example, exposure to ultraviolet radiation and exposure to other mutagens and carcinogens can cause changes to the DNA sequence, and that can ultimately result in a mutation that causes one individual or a handful of individuals in a population to have a different adaptation. Overall, genetic mutations obviously increase the genetic diversity of the population, and that can contribute to the population's ability to persist in the face of a new stressor or selective pressure. Another way in which we can have microevolution occur is through lack of gene flow. If we have two populations, here's one population here and another population here, and there is no movement of individuals between those two populations, let's say there's no migration or whatever, then population A and population B, over time, it's predicted, will become two separate species just because of lack of exchange of genes between the two areas. However, if those two populations exchange members through migration or movement patterns, then that is called gene flow, and the more gene flow I have, the less diversity there will be between these two, the more they will be like one single population. Non-random mating is another possible cause of microevolution. In this case, non-random mating means just what it says. Individuals mate based on some sort of partner selection rather than just grabbing the first partner they come to and mating. For example, inbreeding is a type of non-random mating. If you have members of a population only mating with each other, with relatives or family members, this overall decreases diversity and will lead to microevolution over a relatively fast period of time. Assortative mating is another example. In assortative mating, this is where, and by the way, this is common in humans, typically organisms that are like one another tend to mate with each other. So I'll give you an example. A 7'2" basketball player is probably going to select as a mate a woman who is taller than average. So tall people will tend to mate with tall people, short people will tend to mate with short people. Over that time, that can make for really tall offspring on the one hand and really short offspring on the other. So that can contribute to microevolution. Sexual selection can also contribute. In sexual selection, it's usually males, although not always, but usually males in a population are selected for based on attractive qualities or traits. And a good example of this is peacocks. Peahens, the females will select the peacock, the male, that has the best looking, largest, most colorful tail, because the larger the tail and the more colorful it is an indicator of good nutrition on the part of the male and also a low parasite load, very few parasites in the feathers. So those are traits that the females want their offspring to have. They will select for males in the population that have those features. That's called sexual selection. Lastly is genetic drift, and that's what this picture here is showing. In genetic drift, you can have random chance selection for certain alleles. Maybe these individuals in the population are just randomly selective against death by chance, and so the remaining individuals in the population are left to be the mothers and fathers of subsequent generations. And so over time, the population of frogs will all be green and not brown. All right. Another cause of microevolution is something called the bottleneck effect. And this is antibiotic resistance is another great example of this. If I have a population again of cells and I expose them to an antibiotic, and the antibiotic kills off all but one of these cells, that one cell that's left will then serve as the starting population for more bacteria that all have the same quality of bacteria of antibiotic resistance. When a large population is funneled down to just a handful of individuals, and those handful of individuals give rise to another large population. That's called a bottleneck effect. You're going through literally the neck of a bottle with very few individuals for a generation or 3 or 4, and then coming out the other side with more individuals. A great example of this are cheetahs. You all know of cheetahs in Africa. Cheetahs in Africa have gone through a bottleneck within the last few centuries, and as a result, only a handful of members populated the current populations we have now. And because of that, all the cheetahs in existence today are extremely genetically similar to one another. So similar, in fact, that you can take skin from one cheetah and graft it onto another cheetah, and there is no rejection of the skin. In other words, there's no organ rejection. That means they're incredibly similar to one another. And that's not a good thing. If there's a disease to which cheetahs are susceptible, if that disease comes in contact with the cheetahs, it will not just wipe out a few individuals in the population, it will wipe out the entire species. And scientists are very afraid of that happening. MRSA infections are another good example. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus is a type of bacterium that has become highly resistant to just about every type of antibiotic we can throw at it, including methicillin, which is a powerful antibiotic that used to be quite successful at killing off Staphylococcus aureus and now is no longer very effective. Last cause of microevolution that we're going to discuss is something called the founder effect. And the founder effect is kind of like a bottleneck effect in the sense that a few individuals from a population moved to a new location and found an entirely new population of individuals. And thus whatever genes they bring with them are the only genes that are passed on to subsequent generations. So if there's any mutations among the individuals in the population, they are going to pass those mutations down. A good example of this is back east. There are some Amish populations in which there were a few founding individuals who came from Eastern Europe, came to the United States, founded Hutterite and Amish populations, and within those populations some individuals had a mutation for polydactyly, which means extra fingers and toes. And you can see in this picture of this child here that there is indeed a 6th finger on this child. It's a very common feature among members of this colony. That's called a founder effect. Now, next up, we're going to be talking a little bit more about some different types of natural selection that cause this microevolution to occur.